January 1942. The air inside the Jeffersonville Quartermaster Depot is thick with the hum of 1,000 sewing machines. The rhythm echoes like distant artillery, needles piercing khaki cloth in mechanical unison. The war in Europe has already consumed millions, and now America must clothe an army rising faster than it can be counted. Rows of women, some seamstresses, some farmers' wives, others fresh from school, bend over endless rolls of olive drab fabric. The smell of wool, oil, and iron mingles in the winter air. Every stitch is measured. Every button must be identical. A foreman moves between tables, clipboard in hand, whispering numbers that sound like orders from the front. Size 36. Batch 4 and 12, tolerance 1/16 of an inch. Somewhere outside, a train whistle cries. Boxcars wait to be filled with crates stamped U.S. Army, bound for ports, bases, and battlefields not yet known. 20 million uniforms will follow, each one identical, each one a small victory of precision over chaos. But how did America make that possible? In 1939, the United States was still a country between wars, powerful in spirit, yet unready for the storm gathering overseas. Its army ranked 17th in the world, behind Portugal and Romania. Soldiers drilled in old uniforms from the Great War, patched and faded, stitched by small contractors who followed no single standard. Each regiment wore slight variations, shades of khaki that shifted from yellow-brown to olive-green, buttons that didn't match, insignias placed wherever the tailor's habit dictated. Then came December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Within weeks, the quiet uncertainty of the 1930s vanished. Men lined up outside recruitment centers. The nation, once hesitant to engage, now faced the monumental task of building an army that would span continents. And to clothe that army, to make them look, move, and fight as one, would become a test of industrial coordination unlike anything in history. The Quartermaster Corps, long a modest branch of logistics, suddenly became the backbone of war readiness. Under the War Department, it was ordered to equip a force that would swell from a few 100,000 to more than 8 million soldiers within a year. Uniforms, tents, boots, belts, gloves, and helmets all had to be produced not in thousands, but in millions. Factories that once made suits for businessmen or dresses for civilians were asked to transform overnight. Textile mills in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina switched to military contracts. Wool supplies, once imported from South America and Australia, were rerouted under wartime priority. Even the dyes, precise shades of olive drab and khaki, were controlled, standardized, and catalogued. The goal was not luxury, but exact repetition. Every private in Kansas had to wear the same cut, the same color, the same strength of fabric as the lieutenant in Normandy. Standardization was now strategy, but the challenge ran deeper than materials. The U.S. Army faced a fundamental question. How do you mass-produce identity? The answer lay in systems, and the Quartermaster Corps began to think like a machine. Engineers replaced designers. Patterns were redrawn to optimize fabric use, reducing waste by fractions of an inch. Buttons were no longer handmade. They were molded in presses calibrated for uniform diameter. The supply chain itself became militarized. Every roll of cloth tracked, every shipment logged, every measurement documented. And behind this industrial rhythm was something invisible yet decisive: precision management. The War Production Board, established in January 1942, issued guidelines that turned chaos into order. Every contractor, whether a textile giant or a small-town tailor, had to conform to the same blueprints. The system demanded absolute consistency, from thread tensile strength to stitch spacing. It was an era when paperwork became as vital as the rifle. Schematics, size charts, and pattern books filled government archives. Each soldier's uniform began as a number: chest size, sleeve length, inseam, translated into coded symbols used across hundreds of factories. Mistakes were not tolerated. A 1-inch deviation on a sleeve could cause rejection. Inspectors, many of them women trained under federal standards, combed through thousands of finished garments each day, measuring, checking, recording. Their precision became part of America's wartime discipline, quiet, unseen, but essential. Yet, even as the machines roared, there was a growing realization: fabric was finite. The demands of war meant cotton and wool were rationed, and substitutes had to be found. The search for durability led to new material blends: half wool, half rayon, and cotton twill strong enough to survive jungle humidity and Arctic cold. By 1942, the first waves of standardized uniforms began rolling off production lines. Identical collars, identical pockets, identical insignias. The Army, once a patchwork of styles, was transforming into a single visual force: disciplined, cohesive, unmistakable. But standardization was only beginning. What followed would merge the might of American industry with scientific precision on a scale no nation had ever achieved. By early 1943, the United States had become something the world had never seen before: a nation functioning like one vast, coordinated factory. Steel, rubber, food, and fabric were no longer civilian goods. They were strategic resources under military command. Behind the front lines of Europe and the Pacific, another kind of battlefield had formed: the production floor. And on that front, uniformity was victory. At the heart of this transformation stood the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, now working hand-in-hand with the War Production Board, WPB, and the Office of Price Administration, OPA. Their mission: create a single, flawless standard for every uniform, every thread, every button. No improvisation, no local variations. Every manufacturer had to obey the same specifications, a system so rigid and detailed that it mirrored the precision of artillery blueprints. This effort was supported by an alliance of textile giants, companies like Hercules, Burlington Mills, and American Woolen, who retooled their looms for the war effort. The government distributed technical manuals outlining exact fiber ratios, thread counts, and dye formulas. Even the humidity and temperature of certain factories were regulated to prevent color distortion in the final fabric. To maintain identical shades of olive drab, chemists worked with the Textile Color Card Association to create a wartime standard: olive drab number 3, soon replaced by olive drab number 7, a darker hue that offered better camouflage in the European theater. The color itself became a weapon, carefully engineered to reflect less light under different weather and terrain conditions. Patterns were digitized, though the term digital didn't yet exist. Giant drafting tables replaced sketch pads. Engineers used blueprints scaled to thousandths of an inch, ensuring that sleeve angles, pocket flaps, and collar lengths were mathematically identical across thousands of copies. Every pattern piece was cut, using industrial dies forged in steel. Blades that could slice through 40 layers of fabric at once, each layer perfectly aligned. Factories were inspected by quartermaster officers who carried precision rulers and thickness gauges instead of rifles. Their battlefield was the production line. Their mission: eliminate error before it reached the front. Each accepted batch was stamped with a lot number, ensuring full traceability. If a shipment of uniforms failed inspection in Europe, the Quartermaster Corps could trace it back to the exact factory, the exact day, the exact cutting machine. But what truly unified this vast network wasn't just machinery. It was information. For the first time in history, America's industrial system operated through centralized data. War production offices in Washington communicated daily with factories across 46 states through telegraphs and coded reports. Schedules, output rates, and quality statistics were transmitted, reviewed, and adjusted like battlefield intelligence. It was the dawn of logistical computing. Long before computers existed, the human side of this system was equally disciplined. More than 600,000 workers, most of them women, staffed textile mills and sewing plants. Many had never worked in industry before, yet within months they mastered precision manufacturing under military training. Posters on factory walls reminded them, "His life depends on your stitch." Every uniform was treated like a soldier's armor. Every mistake could cost a life. The system also relied on something uniquely American: decentralized mass production. Instead of concentrating all output in one giant plant, the Quartermaster Corps distributed contracts across hundreds of regional factories. This reduced vulnerability to sabotage and ensured uninterrupted production if one facility went offline. Small-town workshops in New England, the Midwest, and the South contributed alongside major textile centers. The pattern was universal. The pride was local. By 1944, this web of synchronized factories could produce nearly 50,000 uniforms per day, each one indistinguishable from the last. To sustain output, raw materials were rationed and recycled. Old uniforms were shredded into fibers, respun and rewoven. Nothing was wasted. In these years, precision became ideology. It wasn't just about clothing soldiers, it was about demonstrating that democracy could be as efficient as tyranny. While German factories relied on forced labor and secrecy, American plants ran on cooperation and open standards. The workforce didn't march to orders. They worked through shared purpose, union discipline, and a belief that precision itself was patriotic. By the end of 1944, the United States had solved the impossible. 20 million uniforms, perfectly standardized, ready for any battlefield on Earth. But behind every seam and measurement lay deeper stories of human endurance, of scientific ingenuity, and of leadership that turned chaos into control. And it's through those very stories that we understand how America's industrial miracle became a symbol of unity in wartime. Want tider Japan tron fam tronminder. The human angle, hands behind the machine, before the uniforms reached the battlefields, they passed through the hands of ordinary Americans, millions of them. Women who once sewed dresses for their children now worked 12-hour shifts cutting military cloth. In towns like Reading, Pennsylvania, and Manchester, New Hampshire, sewing floors became battlefields of endurance. The whir of Singer machines replaced gunfire, but the sense of duty was just as fierce. They called themselves the Home Front Army. Every stitch carried emotional weight. Many women stitched uniforms for sons, brothers, or husbands stationed overseas. To them, this wasn't factory work, it was contribution. When inspectors rejected a garment for being half an inch off, it wasn't seen as failure. It was discipline, patriotism, precision turned moral duty. Government training films and posters reminded them daily. Uniformity saves lives. One weak seam can fail under fire. Even foremen began to speak like soldiers. Supervisors referred to sewing lines as platoon, Farland T, Tidern 4. The leadership angle. Commanding precision, every army needs generals, not just on the battlefield, but behind the factory gates. For the U.S. Army's uniform operation, that general was Edmund B. Gregory, Quartermaster General of the United States Army from 1940 to 1946. Gregory was not a soldier of glory or medals. He was a soldier of numbers, a man who saw war in columns, quotas, and schedules. Under his command, logistics became strategy. He believed that the discipline of war should extend to production. Factories were to follow chain-of-command principles: design, test, approve, deploy, just like military units. His headquarters in Washington received thousands of daily reports on textile output, material consumption, and defect rates. Each morning, he reviewed production bulletins the way a field commander reviewed troop positions. Gregory's genius lay in coordination. He didn't just order materials, he built relationships. Textile magnates, factory owners, labor unions, and engineers all fell under his quiet but firm influence. He met them not as businessmen, but as fellow officers in the same campaign. Under his leadership, the Quartermaster Corps became a symbol of trust and efficiency, a model copied by other branches of the U.S. military. By 1944, Gregory had created a network that could respond to crisis instantly. When supply lines were disrupted, he could redirect fabric from one region to another within days. His motto was simple: "No soldier shall want for clothing." And none did. His management culture became a new kind of command, one built on communication, accountability, and absolute precision. In a war often remembered for its battles, Gregory's battlefield was a blueprint. His soldiers, the seamstresses and machinists who stitched America's order into being. The enemy comparison. Germany, the USSR, and the uniform paradox across the Atlantic. Germany faced the same challenge, but took a very different path. The Wehrmacht and SS uniforms, while iconic, reflected an opposite philosophy: individuality over uniformity. Tailored cuts, officer-specific designs, and variations across ranks gave the German army a distinct but fragmented appearance. Each manufacturer produced slightly different shades of field gray, depending on available dye and fabric quality. The result was elegance at the expense of consistency. By 1943, German factories, strained by bombing and material shortages, could no longer maintain precision. Soldiers often wore mismatched tunics and trousers, scavenged from earlier campaigns or stitched from substitute fabrics. Even insignias began to lose standard placement, creating confusion in identification. The Soviet Union, too, pursued mass uniform production but lacked America's industrial infrastructure. Factories were centralized, often relocated eastward to avoid German bombings, but faced constant shortages. Soviet uniforms were functional yet crude, durable but inconsistent, varying by region and resource availability. Only the United States achieved both scale and precision. Its system of distributed production, thousands of small, synchronized factories, ensured resilience, while its engineering-based standardization guaranteed visual and structural perfection. In essence, the American uniform became a metaphor for its democracy: unity without centralization, discipline without tyranny. What Germany achieved through control, and the USSR through compulsion, America achieved through coordination. That difference, invisible in fabric, was decisive in spirit. The moral and economic angle, precision as patriotism, the war's industrial effort was not driven by force, it was driven by belief. The uniform became a moral object, a symbol of equality in a nation at war. Every worker knew that what they produced had meaning beyond the paycheck. To sew a uniform was to clothe a citizen soldier, a person fighting not for conquest, but for the preservation of freedom. The Roosevelt administration understood this psychology well. Propaganda never glorified wealth or reward. It glorified precision, sacrifice, and unity. Factories hung signs that read, "Standardization is victory." Uniforms mean unity. By 1943, the United States had entered full industrial war. The hum of production had become the nation's soundtrack, an endless percussion of engines, presses, and sewing machines that played day and night without pause. The Quartermaster Corps' network now stretched from New England textile towns to southern cotton mills, from Chicago's industrial warehouses to Pacific coastal ports. Every region of America pulsed to the same rhythm: production without deviation. At the Philadelphia Quartermaster Depot, the largest uniform hub in the world, inspectors worked in shifts around the clock. The building smelled of oil, fabric, and sweat. Rolls of wool serge cloth arrived by the trainload, stacked in towering walls. Workers unfolded each bolt, cutting it into standardized panels guided by steel dies that could slice through 40 layers of cloth in one motion. The sound was deafening, a sharp hiss of blades followed by the rhythmic hum of sewing machines in perfect cadence. No two workers ever touched the same garment from start to finish. Each was responsible for a single stage, a collar, a sleeve, a pocket, each done exactly as the blueprint required. The assembly line had reached military perfection. A factory in Reading, Pennsylvania, specialized in shirts. Another in Baltimore produced only trousers. Smaller contractors handled field jackets and greatcoats. Each shipment was coded and logged. Its measurements matched to an Army size index that covered 140 distinct body types. For the first time in history, clothing for millions was being manufactured with near-scientific precision. Every morning, the Quartermaster General's office received telegrams listing daily output. Kansas City, 15,200 units complete. Brooklyn, 18,700. Jeffersonville, 12,400. These numbers were not just statistics. They were units of readiness, soldiers clothed before deployment. The process was ruthless in its accuracy. Any batch found defective. A misaligned buttonhole, a wrong die lot, was scrapped without hesitation. Perfection was not negotiable. The nation's railways, too, had joined this silent operation. Trains loaded with uniform crates crisscrossed the country, their contents bound for ports like San Francisco and New York. Each crate bore the same stencil: QMC approved, standard issue. The logistics chain ran with almost biological precision, a living system feeding the global war effort. Factories were organized under the principle of just-in-time production long before the term existed. Fabric arrived, was cut, sewn, inspected, packed, and shipped in synchronized waves. The entire cycle could take less than 10 days from raw cloth to battle-ready uniform. It was during this time that America reached its industrial zenith. By mid-1944, uniform production peaked at nearly 1.2 million garments per week. Over 3,000 factories participated, supported by more than 500,000 workers and 40,000 inspectors. To maintain precision, inspectors used measuring boards marked in 1/16-inch increments, tolerances so strict that rejected batches were often indistinguishable to the human eye. And yet, what made this achievement extraordinary wasn't just speed or volume, it was sameness. A jacket made in Missouri had to be identical, down to the millimeter, to one produced in Massachusetts. Soldiers in Italy could receive replacements shipped from Oregon and never notice the difference. In a war fought across oceans, that sameness became strategy. The Quartermaster Corps called it functional uniformity. It meant that the Army could move men and material without fear of mismatch or shortage. It meant that supply officers could distribute clothing from any shipment to any unit in the world, confident in fit and quality. This logistical perfection saved lives. Reports from the European front praised the dependability of American clothing. Unlike German soldiers, who often wore ill-fitted or patched uniforms, U.S. troops could rely on constant replacements. Uniforms arrived dry, sealed, and ready for wear, their consistency reflecting the order of the nation that sent them. At home, propaganda celebrated these unseen victories. Newsreels showed women at sewing machines and inspectors with calipers, accompanied by narration that said, "Precision is America's power. Every stitch is a bullet fired for freedom." For every rifle fired overseas, hundreds of machines hummed back home. For every victory in Europe, thousands of uniforms had already been prepared. Silent soldiers of fabric, carrying America's discipline across oceans. By late 1944, the U.S. Army had surpassed the milestone no one thought possible. Over 20 million standardized uniforms produced tested, and distributed worldwide. The result wasn't just clothing, it was confidence, visible proof of industrial dominance. But while the factories achieved perfection, the war itself was shifting. As Allied forces moved toward victory, the purpose of mass uniformity began to change. What had been a symbol of readiness now became a symbol of identity, of shared sacrifice, of collective endurance. The next stage would not be measured in numbers or stitches, but in the faces of those who wore them into the storm. By the spring of 1944, the uniform had traveled farther than any American soldier. It was already in England, waiting in warehouses stacked from floor to ceiling, each crate marked with the same black stencil. QMC, Standard Issue, 1944. When the invasion of Europe began, these crates moved in silence before the storm. The quartermasters in charge of the D-Day supply lines called it Operation Threads. In the months leading up to June 6th, uniform convoys rolled across Britain under blackout conditions. They carried jackets, trousers, boots, and caps by the millions, all identical, all ready for the moment the first wave would step ashore. It was said that before the beaches of Normandy were filled with men, they were filled with cloth. When the invasion began, the American soldier was recognized instantly, not by face, not by rank, but by the cut of his jacket, the stitching of his pockets, the curve of his cap. That uniform had become the flag itself. On the beaches of Normandy, it soaked in salt water and sand. In the hedgerows of France, it was torn, patched, and stained. And yet, every replacement that arrived weeks later, dropped from cargo planes or unloaded at Cherbourg, matched perfectly. No matter how far from home, every soldier could pull on a fresh set and feel, if only for a moment, the order and safety of home. A report from a supply sergeant in the 29th Infantry Division captured this feeling. They come in boxes, clean and dry. Doesn't matter if you're in a trench or a barn. When you put it on, it fits. Feels like the Army remembered you. That sameness was not an accident. It was deliberate compassion, engineered into fabric. While soldiers fought across Europe, thousands of miles away in the Pacific, another army wore the same symbol. On jungle islands from Saipan to the Philippines, quartermaster supply chains faced an entirely different war. Heat, humidity, and endless distance. Uniforms here had to survive salt, rot, and monsoon rains. And yet, the crates marked QMC approved still arrived. Carried by Liberty ships through typhoon seas, the tropical uniforms, lighter, looser, but still standardized, became a quiet marvel of wartime logistics. They were made of a new cotton sateen weave, breathable yet durable, dyed in a shade known only as olive drab numbered 7. Each one tested for fade, tear, and resistance to mildew. Proof that even in chaos, precision held. In both theaters, soldiers often never saw the factories, never knew the names of the women who had cut the cloth or the inspectors who measured every seam. But they trusted the result. When the world was breaking apart, their uniforms did not. Photographs from the liberation of Paris show lines of American troops marching past crowds. Every jacket pressed, every insignia aligned, every crease sharp. To the watching world, this wasn't just an army. It was the image of a nation united in discipline. In black and white newsreels, that uniform seemed almost immortal. Neither rain, nor fire, nor distance could change it. Even enemy soldiers noticed. German intelligence reports described American uniforms as astonishingly consistent, noting that their garments fit as though made by one tailor, regardless of origin. They were right. There was only one tailor, America itself. Back home, the rhythm of production continued. The war had reached its climax abroad, but in the factories, nothing slowed. Women still clocked in before dawn, machines still rattled through the night, and trains still departed under the same seal of approval. To them, Each finished jacket wasn't just a garment. It was a life, a son, a brother, a husband who might wear it through a storm and come home because of it. The final inspection process became almost ritualistic. Before a shipment could leave, a senior inspector would unbox one sample, lay it flat under the lamp, and whisper the same quiet oath. Measured, tested, approved. By late 1944, America's supply chain was a weapon of its own. The German army, struggling with shortages and mismatched gear, began to collapse under logistical strain. The Japanese, too, faced starvation and lack of proper clothing in the Pacific's final months. Meanwhile, American forces remained supplied, fed, clothed, and equipped beyond imagination. It wasn't just firepower that won the war. It was the ability to replace, to renew, to restore. In the words of General Brehon Somervell, head of the Army Service Forces, "No army can fight on an empty stomach, and none can stand naked in the rain." Victory is the product of uniformity. By the winter of 1944, the 20 millionth uniform had been produced, the symbolic garment that completed the Quartermaster Corps' impossible promise. It was packed, stamped, and shipped to the European theater. Its recipient is unknown, perhaps a private in the Ardennes, or a medic near Bastogne. But wherever it was worn, it became part of the living proof that the system had worked. That same winter, snow fell over the battlefields. Soldiers huddled in foxholes, their uniforms darkened with frost. And still, the seams held. The stitching never failed. The standard endured. By spring of 1945, as the war neared its end, the uniform stood as a final symbol. Not of war, but of endurance. It was more than fabric now. It was the thread that connected a nation's workers, soldiers, and ideals into one. Spring, 1945. The thunder of war is beginning to fade, but the machines of the Quartermaster Corps still hum with urgency. No one yet dares to stop. Not until the last man is fed, clothed, and ready. Across the Atlantic, the front lines have moved deep into Germany. The roads are choked with convoys of olive-drab trucks, their sides marked U.S. Army Quartermaster. Inside, crates of uniforms sit beside ammunition and food, all bound for men advancing through towns reduced to ashes. Each box bears the same stenciled promise: property of the United States government. The factories back home run 20 hours a day. In Detroit, New York, Chicago, and San Antonio, sirens still sound at dawn, calling thousands of workers to their posts. The smell of machine oil mixes with dust and sweat. Posters on the walls read, "Your hands clothe the heroes of freedom." Many of the women who began stitching in 1941 now have sons wearing what they sew. Some have already received telegrams bearing the words "Every mother fears." Yet, they keep sewing, quietly, steadily, as if each stitch could reach across the ocean and protect whoever still stands. By April, the war in Europe is collapsing. American forces sweep across the Rhine, their ranks still uniform, still precise. When the first GIs step into liberated concentration camps, they do so wearing the same olive drab that had begun its journey 4 years earlier. In the black and white photographs of Dachau and Buchenwald, the contrast is haunting. The clean, symmetrical lines of the U.S. uniform against the chaos of human suffering. To survivors, those soldiers seemed almost unreal, identical, steady, unstoppable. For many, the sight of that uniform was the first image of liberation. In early May 1945, Germany surrenders. Church bells ring, gunfire ceases, and for the first time in years, the factories fall silent. The Quartermaster Corps sends one final transmission across its global network. Cease priority production. Maintain existing stock. Prepare for Pacific redeployment. But there is no rest yet. Half a world away, The Pacific War still rages. The same olive drab shipments now head toward Okinawa, and soon, they expect, toward Japan itself. In California's depots, workers pack lighter tropical uniforms for jungle and island duty, rolling them into neat bundles tied with cotton tape. By summer, when the atomic bombs fall and Japan finally surrenders, the United States has already prepared enough clothing to outfit every man who might have invaded the Japanese mainland. And then, it ends. The machines stop. The needles fall silent. The war that demanded 20 million uniforms finally releases its grip. Inside the Jeffersonville Quartermaster Depot, the last shift gathers in quiet disbelief. The foreman, who has not missed a single day in 4 years, stands among the empty tables. Sunlight spills through the high windows, dust hanging in the still air like suspended memory. On one table lies a single jacket, olive drab, pressed and folded, the last in its line. He picks it up, smooths the fabric, and whispers to no one in particular, "That's the last one." Some workers cheer, others cry. For the first time, the silence is louder than the war. Outside, trains that once carried endless crates now return empty. The loading docks are bare, but the impact of what was done, of 20 million identical garments born of faith, discipline, and necessity, continues to ripple across the world. When soldiers return home, they bring their uniforms with them. Some hang them in closets, others fold them into trunks. Many keep them as a reminder of where they'd been, of the men they'd stood beside, and of the invisible hands that made their survival possible. Those uniforms, still marked with faded QMC tags, become relics of a nation's unity. In parades and photographs, they symbolize something larger than victory: organization, equality, and endurance. The Quartermaster Corps publishes its final wartime report in late 1945. It includes a single, understated line: production of Army clothing and equipage exceeded 20,000 units, all within prescribed tolerance. Behind that sterile sentence hides one of the quietest miracles of the modern age: the transformation of industrial America into a machine capable not just of fighting war, but of mastering the very chaos of it. Every uniform stitched, pressed, and shipped carried the same hidden mark: made by a nation that refused to fail. And as peace returned, the olive drab faded slowly from streets and fields, but its legacy remained woven into everything that came after, from military logistics to modern manufacturing, from automation to the idea that precision itself could be patriotic. The war was over, but the discipline that built 20 million uniforms would never vanish. It had become part of America's identity, a lesson written not in ink, but in fabric. Late 1945. The guns are silent, the uniforms neatly folded, and the great industrial machine that armed and clothed the United States Army begins to slow. Yet even in victory, the question remains, what now? The war had transformed the American economy into something unrecognizable. Before 1941, the textile industry was modest, regional, and fragmented. By 1945, it was the largest uniformed production system on Earth. 8,000 factories, 3 million workers, and the capacity to clothe an army faster than any nation in history. The Quartermaster Corps, once a quiet logistical branch, had become a symbol of American organization. In the months after VJ Day, the Army's warehouses overflowed. Millions of spare jackets, trousers, and overcoats were stacked floor to ceiling, sealed in brown paper and labeled with barcodes years ahead of their time. The United States had made enough to fight another war. But no one wanted that thought to be true. So the question turned from production to purpose. What would happen to these mountains of cloth, to the endless trainloads of khaki that had defined a generation? The answer reflected a new kind of victory, one that extended beyond the battlefield. surplus uniforms began to flood civilian life. Some were sold to workers rebuilding Europe under the Marshall Plan. Others clothed refugees and displaced persons across the continent. In the Pacific, American uniforms were reissued to Allied forces and reconstruction crews. A symbol of war quietly became a uniform for peace. In small towns across the United States, women who had spent 4 years behind sewing machines suddenly found themselves unemployed, but also newly skilled. They had learned precision, discipline, and quality control on an industrial scale. Many used those skills to enter the post-war garment industry, bringing with them the efficiency that wartime production had taught them. Some founded small clothing companies. Others became supervisors in factories that now produced civilian suits, dresses, and workwear. It was the birth of something unexpected. Modern American manufacturing. The methods refined during uniform production, standardized measurements, interchangeable parts, and batch testing became cornerstones of the post-war economy. The same precision that produced identical jackets now built cars, refrigerators, and radios. The war had taught America not just how to fight, but how to build the same thing perfectly, millions of times over. Meanwhile, the Quartermaster Corps began cataloging everything it had achieved. Its post-war report was nearly 2,000 pages long, filled with charts, specifications, and testing procedures so advanced that many would later inspire peacetime industries. The Corps itself called the achievement an unbroken line of service to the soldier, through design, discipline, and dedication. But behind those numbers was something more human. For millions of returning soldiers, their uniforms became part of their identity. They were worn home on trains, during parades, and even at weddings. In small towns, you could tell who had fought, not by medals, but by the familiar olive-drab jacket that fit as if tailored by history itself. A strange nostalgia began to grow around that sameness. The uniform had come to symbolize equality. Officers and privates, farmers and professors, all wearing the same cloth, all part of the same struggle. It was a reminder that the war, though brutal, had also erased certain lines. In the words of one Army historian in 1946, the uniform became America's second skin, not just for the soldier, but for the nation that learned to move as one body. And as peace settled across the continents, the precision that had once clothed an army began to shape a world learning how to live again. The factories still stood, silent, but ready. The machines that once rattled through the night would soon make the fabrics of comfort, not combat. But before that transformation could begin, another chapter of the aftermath was yet to unfold. The moral reckoning of what industrial power truly meant. The war had ended, but its machinery had changed the human imagination forever. For the first time in history, a nation had proven that industrial order, not chaos, could win a global war. And with that victory came both admiration and unease. In 1946, when the Quartermaster Corps held its first peacetime symposium in Washington, officers spoke not of uniforms, but of systems. They discussed standardization, quality assurance, mass logistics, words that had once belonged only to engineers, now part of the military's moral vocabulary. One general called it the triumph of identical precision. But others wondered what such precision might mean for humanity itself. The war had turned men into numbers, production into survival, and factories into battlefields. 20 million uniforms, all identical, all perfect, had proven the strength of collective effort. Yet that same efficiency also revealed something chilling. When industry and war become one, human individuality disappears into the machine. Philosophers and sociologists of the late 1940s began calling it the uniform age. They saw in those endless rows of olive-drab jackets metaphor, a symbol of modern society's growing conformity. In post-war art and literature, the uniform became a ghost, a reminder of a time when freedom was protected through sameness. But the soldiers themselves remembered it differently. To them, the uniform had never been about obedience. It had been about belonging, the shared courage to face fear together, the invisible comfort of looking left and right and seeing yourself reflected in others. That feeling stayed with them long after they hung their jackets in closets. For many veterans, their wartime uniforms became keepsakes of dignity. They represented the best of what people could do when asked to serve something larger than themselves. Years later, when those veterans returned to build highways, lead companies, or start families, they carried with them that same sense of order and purpose, the same precision that had once defined every seam of their clothing. Economically, the war had launched America into a new era. The technologies born from military textiles, synthetic fibers, automated looms, chemical dyes, and mass inspection methods found their way into civilian industries. By 1950, clothing factories that once made uniforms were producing jeans, coats, and sportswear for the booming middle class. Even fashion designers began to borrow from the simplicity and durability of military garments. Globally, the impact was even greater. Nations rebuilding from the ruins of war looked to the United States not only for aid, but for example. Factories in Britain, France, and Japan began adopting the American model of specification manufacturing, a system in which every product, no matter where made, met a single, defined standard. It was the beginning of the global supply chain. In that sense, the 20 million identical uniforms had done something extraordinary. They had taught the modern world how to coordinate, replicate, and sustain perfection at scale. Yet the moral echoes of that precision lingered. The same methods that clothed armies could also build weapons, or control economies, or shape societies into uniform patterns of thought. The line between discipline and dehumanization had never been thinner. Historians looking back on the quartermaster miracle often see it as both triumph and warning, proof that order, when unchecked, can become its own kind of power. But in the context of 1945, it remained a symbol of redemption. In a war that had consumed tens of millions of lives, the ability to produce 20 million identical uniforms without failure was not just industrial genius. It was an act of unity. It showed that a democracy, with all its differences and doubts, could still organize itself into a single beating heart. And though the factories would later be dismantled, their legacy lived on. In every assembly line, every quality standard, every idea that precision could serve peace as well as war. The Quartermaster Corps returned to its quiet duties, its wartime glory fading into archives and warehouses, but somewhere, folded in attics and museums, the olive drab still speaks, not of conquest, but of collective will. The war was over, yet the threads remained, connecting a generation that had learned what it meant to build together. And from those threads would rise the post-war world, efficient, ordered, and forever changed. In the end, the story of 20 million uniforms is not about fabric at all. It is about faith, the quiet belief that order could triumph over chaos. Each uniform, stitched in a distant factory, carried something far greater than its material. It carried the idea that even in the largest, bloodiest war the world had ever seen, humanity could still create with care, still measure with precision, still hold on to dignity. When we look at the faded photographs now, endless rows of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, each identical in olive drab, we see more than discipline. We see a civilization learning to synchronize its will, a million hands working toward one purpose, unseen yet essential. That sameness was not soullessness. It was survival. For every man who stepped into battle, there was someone, somewhere, who had shaped the fabric that would keep him warm, dry, and recognized. Someone who believed that perfection mattered, not for beauty, but for life. The American uniform of World War II became more than a symbol of strength. It became a promise that the ordinary could achieve the extraordinary when guided by unity. In a world shattered by division, the uniform stood for something profound: the possibility of alignment, of precision without cruelty, of collective effort without losing humanity. And when the war was done, and the machines were silent, the legacy endured. That same discipline, the pursuit of exactness, the refusal to fail, built the world that followed. Every factory, every production line, every global standard owes something to those 4 years when cloth became courage. If you hold one of those jackets today, heavy, simple, perfectly measured, you can still feel it. The heartbeat of an age when an entire nation moved in unison, when precision became hope, when the thread of survival was also the thread of unity. That is how the U.S. Army created 20 million uniforms with identical precision, not just through machines or orders, but through belief.